So as you've seen, I've just finished up my PhD, and that was on the politics of trauma, looking specifically at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that was trying to understand how this concept of psychological trauma is engaged with and responded to within political processes, particularly in what are often referred to as post-conflict environments. So I did some research there in South Africa to understand how people understand this term trauma, how it's related to, responded to, and engaged with on a political level. And so now that's sort of come to an end, but of course that project will continue in my brain and moving forward with the projects I'm working on now. And that includes, I'm doing some work on the evolution of international criminal justice, particularly looking at the case of Rwanda. So that's one thread of my research at the moment. Another thread is what I refer to, and I really developed on from my thesis, is more of a methodological reflection on my position in my own research and what it means to be more reflective and aware on our own positionality. And that draws on more of decolonial and intersectional feminist literature to think about what we can do as, particularly as scholars from the global north, researching in the global south, and how we need to be aware of what I call an ethics of care, which is sort of a feminist approach to ethics in research relationships. So that's sort of one project. And I'm also working on, with a group of scholars, some research on ableism and activism in academia and beyond. So looking at how we understand and engage with, and how processes of ableism are inherent in a lot of these research practices, but also in a lot of activism, and how we can sort of understand the interaction of ableism with sort of other activities that and activism that occurs. So those are my sort of main projects at the moment that I'm working on. For me, the most important thing is that understanding the lived experience of those who lived through both apartheid, the transition, and what is called post-apartheid South Africa, that actually the struggle for them is not over. The people that I worked with in my thesis, the voices that I speak with, demonstrate sort of how their struggle, their suffering, their pain really isn't over in the way that perhaps South Africa is portrayed as now being sort of a post-apartheid state, and needing to recognize actually the ongoing suffering and inequality and violence that occurs in South Africa that's really important. And for me, what my thesis explores is how the concept of trauma contributes to the idea of a closing down of discussion on how struggle and suffering endures over time, and really trying to contain that suffering and that pain to a specific moment in history or a specific moment in time, whereas actually the voices that I speak with demonstrate that suffering cannot be contained, it's ongoing. And so that's sort of where I'd like to contribute on a sort of broader conversation level, but also for the means of scholarship, thinking about how trauma and concepts such as trauma actually close down conversation and restrict the voices of people who struggle and suffer and endure pain on an ongoing and sort of long-term basis. I think a lot of the time people assume that what I do is not IR, or they think that, you know, I'm sort of on the boundaries of IR, or trying to mainly talk to another area but linking it to IR. And what I'm trying to do is the opposite, right? I'm trying to place myself within international relations, but demonstrating what's missing in international relations by drawing on these other disciplines, these other histories, these other trajectories, and trying to show to international relations scholars, students, audiences that actually we need to take these other strands, these other histories, these other concepts more seriously within international relations. And I do think that there are, of course, dangers involved with doing such interdisciplinary work. Of course, I am not sort of a psychology expert or a mental health expert. So, of course, there are dangers there of appropriation and sort of misunderstanding the disciplinary complexities of concepts such as trauma. But I don't think that should prevent us at least from trying to understand more in detail what these concepts mean and what they can do. one of my supervisors used to say to me, just because it's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I think there's a lot that we need to look at, which is exciting for the discipline. It means there's a lot of room and potential for young scholars and students to come forward and say, hey, IR needs to look at this. For me, I've noticed in my scholarship that there's a real need to engage more with race and sort of colonial and imperial politics and relations, which have been sort of overlooked, or if not sort of covered up by some of the more traditional IR approaches. I think that also goes for conversations about gender. Of course, we've got some incredible feminist IR scholarship, but I do think that there's room for more. And also conversations about ableism. Again, this is something that I'm working on with a group of scholars, and I do think this is a conversation that needs to be had. So a lot to do with prejudice and power, I think, is something that needs to be talked a lot more about in IR. And I think recognizing our own positions as IR scholars within those conversations is, again, something that can be pushed further. This is something that I'm personally quite passionate about, which is sort of recognizing the researcher in the research, and like how we as humans are doing this research has an impact on all of the research, and trying to engage with ourselves as not just sort of scholars with outputs, but actually as humans with feelings, with emotions, with biases and prejudices, and like that impacts the knowledge that comes forward. So there's a lot of, I think, sort of area for substantive evolution on those topics, but also like methodological evolution in IR as well. I think both of those things are really important moving forward.